Hello and welcome to another tutorial. This is part 10 of the Building the Blog series. So here we're looking at building a favorites feature. So we're going to go through the motions of building a very simplistic favorites feature, have a look at some of the different features we might want to include in the favorites feature. So for example, hiding items if the user is logged in or isn't logged in and so on. So this is a simple process. So we're going to just extend the existing model using a many-to-many field. That's going to allow us then to create the logic where we can save the user ID in existing posts or connect the user ID to existing posts if the user wants to save a post as a favorite. So we'll go through editing the template, creating the logic, which is literally just 8 lines of code, and then we initiate the save using URLs. So we'll pass some data over through the URL to the view. So we'll have a look at, towards the end, hiding the save feature from users who are not authenticated. And in addition to that, for those who are authenticated, we need to swap over what the message says if they do actually save a post as a favorite. So we want to move from add to favorite to remove favorite. So here we have the simple blog at part 9. So if you're following this series, maybe you've got to this point. If you do want to download this simple blog at part 9 code, then just have a look in the description. There's also a link to a video which shows you how to actually start the application if you're new to Django and just want to go ahead and complete this tutorial. So if you're working from part 9 of the Building the Blog series code, you will find that you'll need to go into the admin and then just head over, type in admin. That would take you to the admin, and then you'll need to make some new posts. So if you are making a few posts, just make sure that you select the status published, otherwise it won't show if you're new to the series. So I'm just adding one post here. So we'll be able to now add a favorites feature to this to allow the user to click on it and add it to their favorites. And then going back to the home page, we now have a new post so that we can add a button. We're going to add a button right here for favorites. So back in the code, if you remember, we have accounts, which deals with all the account features in our application. We have a blog. This is going to be utilized, or this is utilized for managing all the posts in our database for our blog. So this is where we need to go. So we're going to go to the models. So we're going to now extend the models. So we add a new field to the post table here, post model. We just call that favorites, and we're using a many-to-many field. We create a related name, default none, blank, true. So it can be blank and empty. So what we're trying to do here, just to give you a general picture, is that we have the post table. Inside of this post table are all of our posts. So each post has a favorites field. And what we're trying to do is we're putting the user's ID inside of that field. And for every user that adds a post to their favorites, that individual post has a favorites field where the user ID resides. So what we can do once the user has added some favorites, we can then go and query the database and look for all the posts where the user has added to their favorites, because each post where the user has added a favorite post, their user ID will be placed inside of the favorites field. So working with favorites becomes really easy because the logic is really simple. When the user presses the button to add a post to the favorites, we're just going to take their user ID and put it inside the corresponding post favorite field. And then of course, all we need to do then to remove the favorite is get the user ID again that have clicked the button to remove the favorite, and then remove it from the favorites field of an individual post. So with about 10 lines of code, we've created a very simple favorites feature. Okay, so now let's go over to the template. So that's the blog app here. So all of our templates are in the template folder. So we want to use the blog templates, and then we're going to add the button to the single page. So the single page is where you see the individual post. So the individual posts on the home page, we click on those, that takes us to the single page. So we're now working in the single page, and like I said, we're going to add a button on the right hand side here, a favorites button, and we're just going to use a bootstrap button for that. So here we're working from line 28. We have the post title, so we've identified that, and underneath that we're now adding a new line of code here, which is a simple link. At the moment we're not linking it to anything just yet, but we've just added some text, add to favorites. So this is going to be a button because we're using Bootstrap. We've added the button classes to make it into a button. And then in addition to that, what we're trying to do is add this on the left hand side and this on the right hand side. So we've got two elements here. We're trying to kind of move one on one side and the other on the other side. So we're using deflex from Bootstrap, and then we're going to justify the content in between so that the first element moves to the left, the second element moves to the right. So if we go back in now and just press refresh, you can see we've got the button on the right hand side. It's not exactly what we want. It's just strangely too long. So we'll just change that. So back in the code, let's just now add this to a div. So we save that and go back in and refresh, and now we have the button. So obviously you can change this to a graphic if you wanted to. We're simply just going to use a button like this. So of course you might not want to add it as a button. You just might want some text. Everyone's going to have their own preference and style depending upon what they're developing. So I've just added a class to the H1 just to make the text a little bit smaller. So I'm using the H4 styling for this H1 element here. And if we do remove the button section here, we will just have some text, and maybe that will look better for you. So now we actually have a way for the user to add this item to their favorites. We now need to hook this up to a view, so to perform the logic. So let's go ahead. Now what I'm going to do here is not use the blog. I'm going to be utilizing the accounts because this is an account type of task. So in the URLs for the account, you can see that if you're utilizing the Part 9 code, there's already quite a lot of URLs here. So what we need to do now is just add a new URL here for this favorites. So building a new path for this feature, what we need to do is add a path, and then we need to add the URL. But here I've added an extra parameter here because I want to capture the ID of the post. So if you think that when someone adds something to their favorites, I need to know, or the system needs to know, when we actually add the data to a database, we need to know what post to add the data to. So the idea here is that we're going to pass to the view where we perform the logic, the ID of the post, so we can match the post with the user. So then we just go ahead and complete our URL here. So we're going to add a new view called favorites add, and then we're going to just name it favorites add. Okay, so now we have the path in place, or the URL in place. We can now go over to the views and now configure the logic. Okay, so if you remember, I said that I wanted this feature to be only available to those who are actually authenticated or logged into the system. So you're not going to be able to access this view unless you are actually authenticated. So I use the @login required to perform that action, similar to what I've done with these other views here. So next up, we create a method. So I've called this favorite add, and we're taking in a request and also the ID parameter that we're passing over. So now we want to actually query the database. So we say post, create a new variable post, and we use the get object or 404. So this is just going to return one item, and we want to return an item from the post table, and we want to then also make a match. So we pass the ID of the post over to this view, and now we're going to use that to make the query. So we're just saying that go into the post table and find a post which has an ID of the ID that we're looking for. So in order to get this working, notice that we're using the post table. Now that's inside of the blog. So what we need to do is import that in So previously we've been using models from the accounts because we're working here within the accounts. So now we need to do from and then blog.models. So we need the blog models and we need to then import post. So we need to make sure that we can do that to make the query on the post model in the blogs app. So now we configure the logic for this. So we're going to say if posts. So if post, that's the data that's returned from the initial query that we run. So we captured the individual post that we're working on. And now we're going into that post and we're specifically looking at the favorites field and we're going to run a filter. So we're going to check to see if the ID equals the request user ID. So inside of the favorites, we're essentially checking to make sure if the user ID exists or not. So what we're saying here is that if the user ID is actually inside of this field, then we know that the user has already added this to their favorites. And we've got exists. So we're checking to see if it exists. If it does exist, then what we're going to do is we're going to say post favorites, and then we're going to remove. And we're going to remove the actual user ID from the favorites field. So that will no longer be a favorite for that particular user. So of course, if we can't find that within the field, then obviously what we want to do is add the user ID. So post.favorites add user ID. So now we've actually added the user to the field, and we now have a favorite being established for that particular user. Okay, so finally, we utilize the HTTP response redirect just to redirect the user back to the page that they are on. Obviously, at this point, they've pressed the button, and if they do exist, or if a favorite does exist, then they're going to be removed from that favorite. Else, if the favorite doesn't exist, we've added the favorite for that particular user, and the page just refreshes. Okay, so now we can actually try it out. So we've gone over to in this case, the only post that we have. I click on add to favorites. Notice that nothing looks like it's happening. The page is refreshing. If I move down slightly and add to favorites, you can see that the page is refreshing. So we got the logic in place, but you may have noticed that we didn't actually migrate the database. So let's make migrations, and then we go ahead and we just migrate. So referring to the front end here, there's a few things that we need to do just to potentially remove this item if the user has added the item to their favorites. So we'll deal with that in the later part of the tutorial. Let's now go ahead and add a new item in the admin section for the user so that they can go to the page and see all the favorites that they've saved. So let's go into let's go into the templates, and we want to access the accounts. And inside of here, we're going to add a new file. So we're going to make a favorites.html page. So this is an additional account feature that the user can access. So to build this up, let's first of all go to the profile. And we're just going to copy and paste the items from the profile page. There we go. So this is just going to be a default page. And then of course we now need to add a URL link to this page. Okay, so remember we're working in accounts. So let's go to the accounts and URLs. And we've got the profile delete, profile edit, and so on here. So let's just now underneath here, just add a profile favorites. And we're going to add a new view called favorite list. And I've named that favorite list. So this is just a simple link so that the users can access this view that we're creating. So now we need to build our view, our favorite list view, so that the user can see all of their favorites that they've saved. So in the views, we're going to create a new view at the top here. So we're going to need a login required. Obviously at this point, the user's logged in, they're in the dashboard area or the user area of our website. So we want to protect that. And then we're going to create our new method here. So favorite list, take in the request, and then we're going to run a query. So we're going to say new post.newManagerFilter. So we're just running a query on the post table again in blogs, and we're going to say favorites, so that if we find a post that has a favorites field that equals the user's ID, we're going to return that post. So then we go ahead and we just basically return that post. So I've added a variable here called new. You can change it to whatever you like. So we're just going to return all the posts where the user has actually added that post to their favorites. So now we can go ahead and just complete the template for favorites. So at the moment, it's just got this section here, which is a simple dashboard at the top. So we'll edit that. And then if you remember in the templates for the blog, we have the index. This index page basically just loops around all of the posts. So we can utilize this. So here we have for post in posts. It's basically just going to loop all the posts that are returned from the database. So we can utilize this type of feature. We'll just copy and paste it across to the favorites page and to build up our favorite page really quickly. So this is what we end up with. So we have extending from the base. We then have a title that we're extending. So user's favorite is the title. And inside of the content block, inside of our base, this is what we're going to do. So we include the navigation bar, and then we've got a container. And we're just using the Jumbotron again from Bootstrap. Just add a little bit of text here. So user's saved favorite post, blah, blah, blah. And then we add a new row. So remember that we're returning new from the view. We're returning new with all the data that's returned from the database or the query. So we create a simple loop here, and then for each item, we're going to output this div here, this element, which is going to be a Bootstrap 4 column. So we're just going to make a nice little grid here. And the data that we want to access, the link. So we're going to put this into a link. So this is the link of the post. And then we've got the image of the post, the title of the post, similar to what we've already done in a previous tutorial. So we output the post title and so on. So in addition to that, at the bottom here, we have this element here. So again, I've used a deflex and justified the content. So this is be on the left-hand side, this will be on the right-hand side. So you can see here that I've created a URL to account's favorite again. So this URL here will actually then obviously link to the view that we created. Now, remember how the view works. If the item does exist or the user has added it as a favorite, it removes it. If it isn't a favorite, then it adds it. So here, this is a way of actually removing the item as a favorite. The user simply just needs to click on this link, and then the view will run, see that the favorite is already added, and remove it. So we just add a button here to remove. Okay, so now we can go ahead and access this. So I just refresh the page. We should now have a drop-down item. Okay, so that's the last thing that we need to do. We now need to add it as a drop-down item. So go ahead and access that. So that's in the base and then the navigation bar. So we need to add it as a new item here. So we'll put this under the edit details. So all we need to remember here is the actual link. So the URL was in accounts and then the favorites list. So we called it favorites list in the accounts. So let's just remove some of these. So now we've created a link here to the actual favorites list. I've called it saved posts. So I press save and let's go back and refresh. So now we should be able to drop down. There should be a nice link here. Go to save post and you can see that we don't have anything saved. So now let's go over to the home page, go to the post, add to the favorite. So now let's go back into our saved post and you can now see that we have a saved post. Okay, so I'm just joking. So let's go back into the code. We forgot to do one thing if you remember. So let's go back into the, it's a single page. Remember, we didn't actually add a URL for the button. So now we can just finish this off by adding a URL. I suppose this is the important part and definitely a new feature in the series that we've not included. So go ahead and add a new URL. So it's accounts favorites add. That's the link. And we want to pass in the post ID. So we add this extra attribute here to pass in the post ID. Now remember that's being captured. So accounts URLs, and then it was the favorites add. So we're passing in that ID. And then of course that's then going to go to the view as the ID here. And then we're going to utilize that as part of the query. So let's just try this again. We're going to go to the post, add to the favorites, and we get an error. Okay, so I wasn't expecting that one, but this is an easy one to fix. We haven't defined it. So we simply just need to define, because we actually haven't put this in our shortcuts here. So we just define we're utilizing get object or 404. So we need to import that into our project. So now let's go back here, refresh this page. Right, so add to favorites. And now we get the HTTP responder redirect is not defined because we've not defined that either. So remember that we're utilizing that right here. So in addition to the 404, we also need to add that into our project. So now let's go back again and refresh, add to favorites. Everything seems to be absolutely fine there. So now we can go into our save post and we still don't have it. So that was an easy one to fix. I forgot to actually save the page, the code. So now when we add to favorites, click on add favorites, go to user favorites, we can now see it saved. And now if I click on it again and refresh the page, we can now see it's been removed. So everything is working absolutely okay at the moment. So save post, it's right there. Okay, so first of all, let's just hide this favorites option in the single page here in the blog. Let's just hide this link to ensure that only people that have actually accessed, or sorry, that are actually logged in or authenticated can actually add an item to their favorites list. Now, if you remember, if you go into the base and the nav main, we've actually implemented it here. We use the if request user is authenticated. So we can just copy that down to single and just put it right here. So we can then just end it right here. So we end the if. So the user has to be authenticated to access it. So in a new window here, I'm just going to go into the post and you can see now it doesn't appear if the user isn't logged in. So what we could probably do here is actually have the button, and then if the user isn't logged in, it takes them to the register page. That would maybe be a logical feature to have here, because we're showing that to the user we do have this feature, but you have to be logged in. And obviously we're potentially trying to get users to sign up so that we can use them for a mailing list and build up our community for this page or for this website. So just as a small example, I've created an else here. So we'll just copy and paste the link here, but instead of accounts favorite, we can go ahead and maybe send them to the register link. So we'll just remove the post ID because we don't want to send that. And then we just change the text to, oh no, we can keep it, add to favorites. So when we go back to our page, it now says add to favorites, but if someone who isn't logged in tries to access it, then they should be sent to the register page. There we go. So they're now sent to the registration page. So that feature is now in place. So let's now think about, we need to potentially remove this. If someone is logged in, we don't want them to, we don't want to show the add to favorites button, because we know the logic that's in place. If they do press it again, it's going to remove it from the add favorites, not add it to the favorites. So we have the logic in place already in the other view. In the accounts view, we tested to see if the ID existed on a particular post. So we did that right here. So we can use that code, and you can definitely refactor this, but we've gone into the views of the blog. Now this is where we gather the post or the single post information and display the single post that you see. So we set out a new variable here, which is going to be a Boolean, so true or false. And then we use the same piece of code here. So we're going to check to see, or we've already got the post information right here in the single method here. So all we need to do is check the favorites of that particular post and then filter again. So we're going to check to see if the user ID exists. If the user ID exists, then the user has already added this item to their favorites. So the favorite equals true. So let's just pass that back to the template now. So we do that down here. So we passed it back to the template. So I've added that piece of code. And now we can go back into the single. So what we got now is that we're going to show different things depending depending on if someone is logged in or not. So what we've got now is the if request user is authenticated. So first of all, we're going to check to see if the user is authenticated. If the user is authenticated, then we're going to obviously allow them to add and remove. So what we're doing now is we're going to check the favorite. So if favorite is true, we're going to run this piece of code. So we're going to allow them to remove the favorites. Now I've set this up so that the user can remove favorites by going to the accounts page and then removing the favorites. So I link them here to the favorites. You can just obviously link them to the normal favorites add, and that will obviously remove them. Else, so if the favorite is false, so if they haven't added the post as a favorite, this piece of code is going to run. So this is obviously the traditional code that we utilize to add the item to the favorite. And of course, if they're not logged in, then they're just going to be shown add to favorites and link to the registration page. So they have to register first and then they can start adding items to their favorites. Okay, so that's how the logic works. I've spread this out to make it a little bit easier for you to understand. This definitely can be refactored, but it's working and we can now test to see if it is working. So we're logged in. So we can add this to favorites. And now it says remove favorites. So let's just go to our save post. So it's definitely here. So let's go back to the post. So now we can remove the favorites. And that takes us, like I said, to the favorites page where we actually have to click on the remove button. Okay, so now we don't have any favorites. So that's all the logic in place. So let's just test to see if we aren't logged in. So let's just log out. So when we go now to the post, we have the add to favorites, but that takes us to the account, create an account page. So this was just to try and inspire you to think about different ways to control some of these different features on the page. And hopefully that gives you a kind of a baseline introductory view on how to maybe add items depending on different states of the user. Okay, so here's our baseline for user favorites feature. It's going to be very similar if we made a rating system. It would be a very similar approach, and we'll do that in an additional tutorial. In addition to that, we'll also cover trying to build this utilizing Ajax in an additional tutorial, because this tutorial is getting a little bit too long. So we'll add an additional tutorial for Ajax. So we have now built a user's favorite feature within an existing application. So hopefully you can go now and explore some of those features within your own application. It was a simple process. Hopefully you've seen that we've simply just extended the model using a many-to-many. We've added a template to include a link, which is connected to the logic. And that logic literally is 5 or 6 lines where we're just gathering data about the user and the post and putting it inside of the model that we've extended. And you've seen that we've initiated that using a URL. And of course, that's not the most efficient way of doing it. Ajax would be obviously a little bit more efficient, utilizing Ajax so that the page doesn't refresh. So the last thing we looked at was hiding the save feature from the user who are not authenticated. And we obviously changed some of the parameters so that the user sees different things based upon the state, their login state.